In the late 1980s, the Reformists needed the students' blood. The conservatives needed the students' blood. Even the military needed the students' blood. It was not simply democracy versus dictatorship. The world is rarely so black and white. This tragedy did not happen because things spun out of control, but because it was driven step by step toward an inevitable end. Within the system, if you want reform, you must first have power. Without power, no matter how brilliant your economic blueprint is, it is nothing more than a scrap of paper. Thus, a chess game involving political ousting, bribery, and the manipulation of public opinion officially commenced within Zhongnanhai. The Reformists had only one goal: by any means necessary, they had to force the conservative elders out of power. In the early 1980s, Yaobang made the first move. He introduced the cadre rejuvenation policy, aiming to personally bring an end to gerontocracy. He promoted young cadres on a massive scale, including Hu Jintao and Wen Jiabao. His objective was clear: to use advanced age as a pretext to force the founding veterans to step aside and relinquish their absolute authority over key appointments. But how could those old foxes just sit and wait for their doom? They retaliated immediately, and fierce resistance arose over selection criteria and procedures. Hu prioritized academic credentials and reform mindset, but Chen Yun did the exact opposite, emphasizing political loyalty and insisting that only their own loyalists were trustworthy. Just imagine, if you were one of the founding elders at that time, who had risked your life to build the empire, only to be forced out of power by a bunch of youngsters, left with nothing in your twilight years, could you possibly tolerate it? The conflict between the two factions began to escalate dramatically from this point onward. By the mid-1980s, it was Zhao Ziyang's turn to make a move, shifting the battlefield from political struggle to economics. One of his strategies was the highly controversial dual-track pricing system. Yes, you heard that right. The official corruption that the students on the square denounced the loudest and hated the most was, to some extent, approved by the reform leader Zhao Ziyang himself. Could even be considered one of the direct fuses that ignited the incident of 1989. At that time, the greatest resistance to reform came from the mid-level bureaucrats who held the power of resource allocation. Reasoning with them? Useless. Shouting slogans? They treated it like background noise. Since reasoning was futile, they chose to buy them off with pure self-interest. Thus, the government began to allow officials to purchase materials at artificially low state prices and turn around to resell them at market prices multiple times higher. If you were a bureaucrat back then, and pocketed millions just by signing your name, wouldn't you be thrilled? Wouldn't you suddenly support reform? Zhao Ziyang's tactic, in reality, weaponized corruption to combat the old system, using a new vice to solve an old problem. The bureaucrats who were initially most resistant to reform all transformed into the most radical free market advocates. The cost was the gradual collapse of the elders' core power. In the past, which factory got steel and where coal and grain were allocated were entirely dictated by the senior elders. But as resources flowed into the free market, the approval slips in their hands became worthless overnight. To them, losing control over resource allocation meant losing the very foundation of their control over society. This threat of having their livelihoods shattered forced them to quietly gather in the shadows, waiting for their chance to strike back. The severe corruption caused by the dual-track pricing system had already left the nation in widespread anxiety, and sporadic protests were popping up everywhere. By 1987, the elders finally used an excuse to force Hu Yaobang to resign. Yet Zhao Ziyang, who took over, did not back down at all. Instead, he aggressively doubled down. He boldly relaxed constraints on free speech, and even tacitly permitted his subordinates to utilize state-level mouthpieces like People's Daily and Xinhua News Agency to openly advocate for democracy, rule of law, and freedom. He channeled public fury against corruption and official profiteering toward the conservative elders who blocked his reforms, effectively using public opinion to do his dirty work. Little did he know, once this fire was lit, it would spin completely out of control. In 1988, Zhao Ziyang announced the abolition of the dual-track system, transitioning fully to market pricing. As soon as this news broke, panic buying swept across the entire nation, resulting in a hyperinflation rate approaching 20%. Just think about it. If you were an ordinary citizen back then, earning just a few dozen yuan a month, and had to watch your hard-earned savings turn into worthless paper overnight, people were hoarding towels, matches, and even coffins, while the princelings continued to amass fortunes by reselling permits. Tell me, what would be going through your mind? This long-repressed hatred, at this moment, shifted from targeting specific conservatives to targeting the entire political system, ultimately erupting into a rage of total mutual destruction. By 1989, this massive gamble on national destiny met its bloodiest climax. Following the sudden passing of Hu Yaobang, a wave of student protests immediately swept the nation because many believed that the conservatives had driven him to death. Trapped in a political dead end, Zhao Ziyang made a final gamble, leveraging the protest waves of hundreds of thousands of students on the square and the state media that had already defected to make a final stand against the elders. For those founding elders, at this moment, their power over appointments was gone, their power over resource allocation was gone, and even the propaganda machine had turned against them. If they lost this time, it wouldn't just be a simple matter of stepping down, but a total and ruthless political purge. Faced with no way out, they ultimately decided to use the most extreme, violent means to bring this chess match to an absolute end. In this life and death struggle between the two factions, there was one man who remained the ultimate arbiter of the situation. He was none other than Deng Xiaoping. On the surface, he was undoubtedly the chief architect of reform and opening up, but at the same time, he was also the political core brought to power by the elders. Caught in this deeply fractured and severely contradictory position, who would he ultimately back? What kind of role was he truly playing? The answer must begin with an uneven distribution of spoils. Let's take the timeline back to the late 1970s, following the death of Mao Zedong. The successor at the time clung stubbornly to the old ways. Most fatally, he intended to keep all the power and benefits for himself, refusing to share any with the founding veterans. The elders in the military had finally had enough. Since you are acting in bad faith, do not blame us for turning against you. Thus, these factions united and brought forward Deng Xiaoping as their representative, forcing the incumbent state leader to surrender power and step down. They installed Deng Xiaoping into power, was it because they revered democracy or loved reform? At the end of the day, it was solely to protect their own interests. Though Deng Xiaoping successfully assumed power, Zhongnanhai at the time was still entirely dominated by gerontocracy. The conservative elders behind him, like Chen Yun, Li Peng, and Bo Yibo, could easily join forces once again to pull the strings and cast him aside like a puppet. So how did Deng Xiaoping break this deadlock? Since the old system was tightly controlled by the elders, and reasoning with them was pointless, he chose to bypass the system entirely and set up a new arena under the banner of reform and opening up. He personally selected Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang to act as his trailblazers for reform. One was tasked with ideological liberation, teaching the public about democracy and freedom, while the other was responsible for bold experimentation and driving economic trials. Outside of the traditional system, from scratch, he built a faction completely loyal to himself. Think about it. If you were Deng Xiaoping, as more and more people joined the reform wave, and the economic cake outside the old system grew larger, wouldn't you be able to turn the tables and completely suppress the founding veterans behind you? But the most perilous aspect of this high-stakes gamble was that Deng Xiaoping himself was actually walking a tightrope. On one side were his hand-picked protégés, on the other were the cornered elders ready to flip the table at any moment. But here lies the question. Hu Yaobang and Zhao Ziyang were clearly Deng Xiaoping's trusted inner circle, nurtured by him and invested with great hopes. Why did Deng Xiaoping end up personally liquidating them? First came Hu Yaobang. His push for intellectual freedom was too aggressive, resulting in the accumulation of civil dissent that directly threatened the state's governance foundation and ruptured the delicate internal balance within Zhongnanhai. Deng Xiaoping's ultimate fear was that the situation would slip into total chaos, like the Cultural Revolution. To appease the powerful elders behind him, he convened a party meeting and forced Hu Yaobang out of office. But the missteps of Zhao Ziyang, who took over, were multiple times more severe than Hu's. Zhao's economic reforms went completely out of bounds, unleashing rampant corruption and hyperinflation. These errors Deng Xiaoping could still tolerate. But where was the fatal, ultimate red line that was crossed? When the crisis peaked in 1989, Zhao Ziyang, in front of the Soviet head of state, publicly shifted all blame for policy failures onto Deng Xiaoping. He went as far as mobilizing state media under his control and leveraging the protests of hundreds of thousands of students on the square to orchestrate an indirect political coup. In Deng's eyes, Hu Yaobang merely suffered from an ability issue in managing a situation, which was a matter of disappointment, but Zhao Ziyang's actions were vastly different in nature. It was outright political betrayal. It directly violated the supreme red line of stability overrides everything else. Hence, without a shred of hesitation, he cut ties cleanly once more, personally removing his second chosen successor. Yet the ultimate irony remains. Though Deng politically executed both Hu and Zhao when he embarked on his southern tour in 1992, he realized that if China stuck to Chen Yun's stagnant and restrictive birdcage economy, the nation's economy would completely collapse and the entire regime would disintegrate. In the end, the life-saving prescription he produced was exactly the same brand of radical marketization that Hu and Zhao had passionately championed. History ultimately proved that the path he had tried hardest to sever turned out to be the only viable way forward. To supplement this view, on the surface, Hu Yaobang failed because his ideas were too free, while Zhao Ziyang failed because his economics were too radical. But in reality, the true cause of their downfalls had absolutely nothing to do with their mistakes. Because regardless of the route taken, their distinctly different personalities and political styles were bound to lead to the exact same destination. Faced with crisis, Hu Yaobang was too upright and idealistic. He genuinely trusted that Deng and the system would treat him fairly, only to end up politically ambushed and dying in bitter grief. Zhao Ziyang, on the other hand, was a consummate politician. When pushed to the wall, he chose to leverage state media and public opinion to openly challenge the establishment in a final, desperate gamble. Yet no matter what choices they made, their outcomes were entirely identical. Perhaps what seals a leader's political fate is always raw power, never personal competence. Many assume that a government with weapons can dominate everything, and that cracking down is an easy task. But looking back to 1989, the internal fractures within the PLA were the exact existential threat that terrified Deng the most. During the golden era of reform in the 1980s, the military also undergoes a massive transformation, evolving from a backward base army into a highly modernized fighting force. At that time, Zhao Ziyang utilized a highly controversial and even radical strategy, allowing the military to engage in commercial businesses to make fortunes in exchange for the armed forces' backing of his economic reforms. This policy transformed the entire military apparatus overnight. A vast number of military descendants and generals' children established private corporations and entered commerce, profiteering heavily from permit trading, gradually giving rise to a powerful new interest group. Whether supporting ongoing reforms to accumulate wealth or using military suppression to restore order best serve their personal financial interests requires no explanation. Therefore, ordering a violent military crackdown was functionally destroying their own lucrative streams of income. In May 1989, the moment martial law was declared, this intense friction between economic interest and moral conscience exploded within the ranks of the military. The first level to waver was surprisingly the top brass. Central Military Commission Vice Chairman Yang Shangkun, despite being Deng Xiaoping's closest political ally, actually shared a profound personal friendship with Zhao Ziyang. Thus, initially the military high command maintained a moderate stance, hoping that Zhao Ziyang would succeed in defusing the entire unrest through peaceful dialogue. But beyond anyone's expectations, 7 founding senior generals jointly submitted a petition declaring the People's Army must never shoot at the people. This open defiance from revered veterans triggered widespread anxiety among mid-level and junior officers. Some felt bound by loyalty to the state, while others were driven by love for the countrymen. At this juncture, the military apparatus fractured and morale began to collapse completely. What terrified Deng Xiaoping above all else was the defiance of the elite 38th Group Army. This highly formidable force, guarding the gateway to Beijing, saw its commander refuse deployment, citing incomplete orders and an absolute refusal to harm civilians, flatly rejecting the command to advance into the city. When even your premier crack unit rebels, the situation becomes critical. At that moment, on the outskirts of Beijing, a profoundly surreal scene unfolded. On one hand, students were offering flowers and food to soldiers, and troops were singing arm in arm with ordinary citizens, with entire columns choosing to retreat or abandon their vehicles. While on the other side, angry crowds set military vehicles ablaze and fatally assaulted isolated soldiers, causing violent clashes to spiral rapidly out of control. Seeing that discipline had dissolved completely, and deeply fearing an internal military mutiny, Deng Xiaoping and Yang Shangkun bypassed the Minister of Defense to mobilize forces across 5 regions, ordering 200,000 troops to converge on the capital. This force included the highly compliant 27th Army and the rapidly deployed 15th Airborne Corps. The operational objective of this mix was to create a mechanism of mutual surveillance. Deng deliberately severed communications between different units, fostering an atmosphere of deep paranoia within the ranks. In such an environment, if one regiment hesitated to open fire, the unit stationed directly behind them might fire upon them instead. To these soldiers, executing the order to fire was their only means of survival. Failing to suppress meant facing immediate execution or being ruthlessly purged later as traitors. Only by drawing blood on the front lines could the soldiers ensure their own survival, the generals prove their loyalty to Deng, and the armed forces demonstrate unconditional obedience to the party. Even worse was the complete and total blackout of information. These 200,000 troops had been kept in isolated encampments for weeks, with radios confiscated and newspapers heavily censored. Furthermore, they were persistently fed reports alleging that rioters were murdering soldiers. Consequently, the frontline troops truly believed they were fighting violent thugs. The students genuinely believed they were confronting heartless butchers, and the leadership in Zhongnanhai genuinely believed they were thwarting a coup. When every faction inhabited an entirely separate reality, bloodshed became a mathematical certainty over time. The most terrifying aspect of June 4th was not that any single side desired an extreme outcome, but that every single player believed that if they lost, they would face absolute and total annihilation. When everyone convinced themselves there was no path of retreat, the deployment of tanks became unavoidable. The Reformists needed the students' blood to break the political deadlock, the Conservatives needed the students' blood to secure absolute stability, the military needed the students' blood to pledge allegiance to the regime, and even China's future trajectory required that blood for stability. On that fateful day, no one desired bloodshed, yet today many have quietly accepted it.